I'm sorry, could you repeat that? Arthur Sterling leans forward, a glint of cruel amusement in his eyes. The crystal wine glass in his hand catches the light from the chandelier, fracturing it into 1,000 tiny daggers. I don't think my guests quite caught the name of the wine. Imani stands perfectly still, the heavy silver tray balanced on one hand, her posture a rigid line of forced composure. The heat rises from her collar, a slow, familiar burn of humiliation she has learned to swallow. Around the table, the air is thick with the scent of money, vintage leather, expensive perfume, and the faint, sweet aroma of roasted duck with cherry glaze. "Of course, sir," she says, her voice even, professional. She has practiced this tone in the mirror, scrubbing it clean of the soft, lilting cadence of her Georgia upbringing, but traces of it remain, an accent Sterling has latched onto like a predator sensing a weakness. "It's the Gewürztraminer from Alsace." Sterling smirks, turning to his guests from Shanghai. Mr. Chen, a man whose quiet presence commands more respect than Sterling's performative bluster, offers a tight, polite smile. His associates exchange fleeting glances, so Imani might have imagined them. "There it is again," Sterling chuckles, taking a sip of the very wine she named. "It's a German word, my dear. The W is pronounced like a V. Gewürztraminer. Try it." He says it with the exaggerated precision of a man correcting a child. Or a pet. Imani's fingers tighten on the edge of her tray. "Gewürztraminer," she repeats, her pronunciation flawless, crisp, and utterly devoid of the accent he is so keen to mock. The correction is subtle, a quiet rebellion in the shape of a word. For a moment Sterling seems taken aback. The smirk falters, but he recovers quickly, waving a dismissive hand. "Close enough, I suppose. Just bring another bottle and more water." Mr. Chen looks parched. Imani nods once, her expression a careful blank mask. "Yes, sir." She turns, her movements fluid and efficient, gliding away from the table without a sound. But she can feel his gaze on her back, a physical weight. As she passes the service station, Mr. Davies intercepts her, his face pale with anxiety. "Just get the wine and stay clear of that table, Imani," he hisses, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "Don't speak unless you're spoken to. Mr. Sterling is our most important guest. We can't afford any friction." Friction, that's what her dignity is called in this world. Friction. "I understand," she says, her voice betraying nothing of the storm raging inside her. She retrieves the wine from the cellar, her hands steady despite the tremor in her heart. She remembers her grandmother's words, spoken over a steaming pot of grits on a humid Savannah morning. "Some folks will try to make you feel small, baby girl, because their own souls are cramped. Don't you ever let them shrink you down to their size." Back in the dining room, the conversation at Sterling's table has shifted. The official translator, a nervous young man with sweat beading on his upper lip, is struggling. Mr. Chen is speaking a soft, regional dialect of Mandarin, his words nuanced and layered with cultural subtext that the translator's textbook fluency can't seem to grasp. Imani approaches the table to pour the wine. As she leans over Sterling's shoulder, her movements practiced and unobtrusive, she hears Mr. Chen murmur something to his associate on his left. "Ta dui zijie de moshi zhengshi wo siu danksenda," he says quietly. His disregard for the small details is precisely what worries me. The associate nods, replying in the same dialect. "Yaj kan bujian fuayan de rain, I can bujian hetong zhang de ziwei zhai chu." A man who cannot see the waitress, cannot see the nuance in the contract. Sterling, oblivious, laughs at some joke he just made. The translator smiles weakly, having understood none of it, but Imani understood every word. She straightens up, the bottle of Gewürztraminer cool against her palm. She looks at these men, the one who sees her as an object of ridicule, and the ones who see her invisibility as a measure of his character. She sets the bottle down, her movements a study in quiet grace. Sterling doesn't even look up. To him, she is just a pair of hands, a ghost in a uniform. He has no idea that the friction he wants to avoid is the one person in the room who holds the key to the entire conversation. He has no idea that the woman whose accent he mocked is listening to his future being decided in a language he can't understand. And he has no idea that she is just getting started. The Wellington Grand was not merely a hotel. It was a fortress of curated perfection. Imani knew its secrets intimately. She knew the precise thread count of the Egyptian cotton napkins, 1200, the vintage of the crystal chandeliers, 1920s Art Deco, restored, and the exact blend of white tea and sandalwood that was misted into the air vents every hour on the hour to create the hotel's signature scent of effortless tranquility. For the past 2 years, this had been her world, a landscape of quiet luxury she maintained but never inhabited. As she moved through the dining room, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the hand-knotted Persian rug, she was a study in practiced invisibility. She refilled Mr. Chen's water glass, noting the slight tightening around his eyes. He was a man accustomed to precision, to respect, and this lunch was providing neither. Arthur Sterling, meanwhile, was holding court. "This partnership, Mr. Chen," he boomed, gesturing with a gold fountain pen that probably cost more than a Manny's monthly rent. "It's not just a deal. It's a legacy. A $500 million handshake that will redefine the luxury hospitality market from here to Shanghai." The translator, whose name was David, scrambled to keep up. His Mandarin was technically correct but stiff, like a brand new suit. He conveyed Sterling's words literally, stripping them of their intended gravitas and leaving behind only the naked ego. Mr. Chen nodded, his expression unchanging, but Amani saw the slight dip of his chin, a micro gesture of polite endurance, not enthusiasm. She'd seen that look hundreds of times in boardrooms in Shanghai, a silent signal that the speaker was losing the room. Amani returned to her station, a small alcove hidden behind a marble pillar, and began polishing silverware that was already gleaming. From here, she had a clear view of the table. She watched as David, the translator, fumbled with his notepad, his face slick with a fine sheen of sweat. He was missing the nuances, the subtle dance of honorifics and indirect phrasing that formed the true language of Chinese business. He was translating words, not intentions. When Sterling boasted about his aggressive acquisition strategy, David used the term gongjizing, a word that carried connotations of military hostility, rather than the more appropriate jiji, which meant proactive or enterprising. It was a small error, but in a negotiation of this magnitude, small errors were like hairline fractures in a dam. Mr. Chen's posture became infinitesimally straighter, his politeness now a shield. Amani felt a familiar ache in her chest, the frustration of holding knowledge that had no outlet. She remembered her dissertation advisor at Fudan University, a brilliant, sharp-witted woman named Professor Lin, who had once told her, "Language is not a tool, Amani. It is a room. If you only know how to open the door, you will never understand the conversations happening in the corners." David was stuck at the door. Amani, meanwhile, was already in the room, silently observing the conversations happening in the flickering candlelight, in the spaces between words, in the careful arrangement of chopsticks laid to rest. The main course arrived, a perfectly seared filet mignon for the Americans, and a delicate steamed sea bass for the Chinese delegation. Sterling launched into an anecdote about a hunting trip, complete with grand gestures and a hearty laugh that echoed slightly too loudly in the refined space. As David translated the story, Amani could see the exact moment the cultural disconnect happened. The story, meant to convey power and rugged individualism, was likely being received as coarse and disrespectful to the harmony of the meal. Mr. Chen took a small, deliberate bite of his fish, his eyes fixed on his plate. He then posed a question to Sterling, his tone measured and calm. David listened intently, then turned to Sterling. "Mr. Chen asks, if you enjoy American sports." Amani almost dropped the fork she was polishing. That wasn't what he'd asked, not even close. What Mr. Chen had actually asked was a beautifully phrased, metaphorical question about Sterling's philosophy on teamwork within his corporate structure, using the analogy of a traditional dragon boat race. "In your company, Mr. Sterling, who holds the drum that sets the pace for the rowers?" It was a question about leadership, about harmony, about collective effort. It was a test, and Sterling, fed a bland, meaningless translation, was about to fail it spectacularly. "Sports," Sterling chuckled. "Absolutely. I've got box seats for the Lakers. Perhaps you and your team would like to join me tonight. We'll get some hot dogs, a few beers. You'd love it." The silence that followed was profound. Mr. Chen's polite smile finally vanished, replaced by a look of deep disappointment. His associates stopped eating. The $500 million deal was now bleeding out on a tablecloth of the finest Belgian linen. Imani stood frozen in her alcove, the polished fork cold in her hand. This was the moment. The fracture was widening into a chasm. She saw Mr. Davies, her manager, wringing his hands near the kitchen door, sensing the mood shift but utterly clueless as to its cause. She saw the translator, David, looking pale and confused, knowing he'd failed but not understanding how. And she saw Arthur Sterling, a man floating on an ocean of cultural ignorance, completely unaware that his ship was sinking. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind again. Don't you ever let them shrink you. But stepping forward felt less like growing and more like leaping from a cliff. To speak up was to shatter the carefully constructed invisibility that kept her employed. It was to invite the very friction her manager had warned her against. She looked at Mr. Chen, a man of quiet dignity and intellect, a man who deserved a real conversation. Then she looked at the heavy weight of her student loans, a debt that chained her to this silent, servile role. The choice was clear: stay safe and watch the deal die, or risk everything for a truth no one else in the room was qualified to speak. The silence at the table was a living thing, cold and suffocating. It pressed down on Imani from her alcove, making the ornate silver platter in her hands feel impossibly heavy. Arthur Sterling's clueless offer of hot dogs and beer hung in the air, a monument to his own arrogance. The $500 million deal wasn't just sinking, it was plunging into an abyss of cultural ignorance, and the only person with a life raft was the one they'd trained themselves not to see. Imani's mind, a finely tuned instrument of linguistic and cultural analysis, raced through a dozen possible scenarios. Each ended with the same outcome: Mr. Chen would offer a polite, inscrutable excuse, the meeting would end prematurely, and the opportunity would vanish forever. Sterling would blame the translator would be fired, and Imani would go back to polishing forks, the silent witness to a preventable disaster. But then she met the eyes of the young man sitting to Sterling's right. Alex, the junior associate. He was barely 25 with a sharp suit that couldn't quite hide his anxiety. Unlike Sterling, who was now frowning with impatient confusion, Alex was watching Mr. Chen with a look of intense, almost desperate concentration. He knew the mood had shattered, he just didn't know why. His gaze flickered around the room, searching for an answer, a lifeline. For a split second, his eyes met Imani's. In that fleeting moment, a decision was made. It was a risk, a colossal one. But the alternative, the quiet complicity of her own silence, suddenly felt like a betrayal of everything she was. With movements born of 2 years of practice, she turned away from the dining room and slipped back toward the service station. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the placid rhythm of the restaurant. She set down her tray and reached for the small notepad she used for taking orders. Her pen flew across the page, her handwriting a fusion of elegant transcription and precise, block-lettered English. First, she wrote down the Pinean transcription of Mr. Chen's question. Zai nin de gongsi. Shi shei naj gu lai wai ha jiang shu ding zia jiezu da. Then, the crucial context David the translator had missed, literal translation: in your company, who holds the drum that sets the pace for the rowers. Context: this is a classic metaphor for leadership. He is asking about your corporate philosophy. Who sets the vision? How do you ensure your team works in harmony? He is testing your understanding of collective effort vs. individual ambition. She tore the small page from the pad, folded it twice, and palmed it. Her hands were not trembling. A strange, calm certainty had settled over her. This was not the act of a waitress. This was the act of an analyst. She picked up a silver water pitcher, its surface cool and steadying against her skin. Walking back into the dining room, she approached the table, her focus entirely on her task. Her movements were a mask of professional servitude. She moved around the perimeter, topping off glasses with practiced ease. When she reached Alex, Sterling was distracted, trying to engage one of Mr. Chen's other associates in a clumsy conversation about the stock market. This was her chance. As she refilled Alex's water glass, she let the folded note slip from her palm onto the white tablecloth, right beside his leather-bound portfolio. It was a whisper of a movement, so subtle it was almost non-existent. She didn't look at him. She simply continued her circuit of the table and retreated to her alcove, her back to the scene, her entire being focused on the sounds behind her. She heard the soft rustle of paper. A pause. A sharp, almost inaudible intake of breath. Alex had found the note. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Imani could hear the clink of Sterling's pen against his glass, a nervous, impatient rhythm. Then she heard Alex's voice, clear but respectful. "Mr. Sterling, if I may," he began, his tone carefully modulated. "I believe there may have been a nuance lost in the translation of Mr. Chen's question about sports." Sterling grunted. "What are you talking about, son?" He asked if I like sports. "Respectfully, sir, I believe it was a metaphor," Alex pressed on, his voice gaining confidence. Manny could picture the note, a tiny beacon of truth, open in his hand beneath the table. "A dragon boat race. I think Mr. Chen was asking about your leadership style, who sets the pace for the team, how you create harmony." The shift in Sterling was immediate. The impatience in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of understanding, then by the predatory gleam of a salesman who's just been handed a new script. "Harmony," Sterling repeated, turning to Mr. Chen with a renewed, more genuine smile. "An excellent question. Forgive my American literalism." He launched into a new monologue, this one not about hunting or box seats, but about mentorship, about fostering a culture of shared success, about how a leader is only as strong as the team rowing with him. He was borrowing the metaphor, but he was using it effectively. Across the table, the tension in Mr. Chen's shoulders visibly eased. He leaned forward, listening now with genuine interest. The ice had cracked. The room, which moments before had felt like a tomb, was breathing again. Imani finally allowed herself to exhale. The rest of the meal passed without incident. The deal was not saved, not yet, but it was no longer dead. As they prepared to leave, Sterling clapped Alex heartily on the back. "Sharp thinking, son. That was brilliant. Knew I hired you for a reason." Alex flushed with pride but shot a quick, grateful glance toward Imani's alcove. It was the only acknowledgement she would receive. To everyone else at the table, the moment of brilliance belonged to the young associate, not the black waitress who refilled their water. Imani watched them go, a complex mix of emotions swirling within her. There was the quiet, fierce satisfaction of a puzzle solved, of a crisis averted, but it was followed by the familiar, bitter taste of invisibility. She had handed them the key, and they hadn't even noticed her hand. The dining room slowly exhaled as Sterling and his entourage departed, leaving behind a wake of half-empty glasses, crumpled napkins, and the lingering ghost of tension. The deal, Imani knew, was still fragile, a patient stabilized in the emergency room but not yet out of the woods. Alex, the young associate, had caught her eye one last time before leaving, a quick, almost imperceptible dip of his head, a silent acknowledgement that passed between them like a secret. It was the only reward she would get, and she knew it. She began clearing the table with a practiced, almost meditative rhythm. Each plate was lifted silently, each fork and knife arranged without a clatter. This was the choreography of her role, to erase the evidence of indulgence, to reset the stage for the next performance of wealth and power. As she stacked the delicate porcelain plates, she could still feel the phantom weight of the manager's gaze. Mr. Davies had been watching her ever since Sterling's group left, his brow furrowed, his lips a thin, worried line. The confrontation came, as she knew it would, in the stainless steel purgatory of the service corridor, a narrow passage between the warmth of the dining room and the chaotic heat of the kitchen. "Williams," Mr. Davies' voice was sharp, cutting through the clatter of pots and pans. "My office. Now." His office was a cramped, windowless cube smelling faintly of stale coffee and disinfectant. He didn't invite her to sit. He stood behind his metal desk, arms crossed, adopting the posture of a man about to deliver a verdict. "What exactly do you think you were doing out there?" he began, his voice low and tight with a fury born of fear. Imani kept her hands clasped loosely in front of her, her gaze steady. "My job, Mr. Davies. I was serving the guests." "Don't play coy with me," he snapped. "You passed a note to the associate. I saw you. You interfered in a private business negotiation. Do you have any idea what was at stake in that room?" "Yes, sir, I do," she replied, her tone even. "That's why I intervened." The quiet confidence of her answer seemed to infuriate him more. "You intervened?" He let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You are a waitress. You are here to take orders, deliver plates, and pour wine. You are not paid to think. You are certainly not paid to intervene. Your job is to be invisible. Is that concept really so difficult for you to grasp? Each word was a carefully aimed dart, designed to remind her of her place in this rigid hierarchy. He wasn't just angry, he was offended by her competence. To him, it was a transgression, a violation of the natural order of things. The translator was making critical errors, Imani stated simply, refusing to be drawn into an emotional argument. The deal was collapsing because of a misunderstanding. I provided a clarification. You provided a distraction, he shot back, leaning over his desk. You're lucky Mr. Sterling was so impressed with his own associate's quick thinking that he didn't notice a member of the catering staff playing spy. You got lucky, Williams, but luck runs out. Her mind flashed back to a seminar room in Shanghai, debating the semiotics of international trade law with students from a dozen countries. Now, in this airless little office, she was being told not to think. The irony was a physical thing, a bitter pill caught in her throat. With all due respect, sir, she said, her voice still maddeningly calm. What I did protected this hotel from losing the most significant client it has hosted all year. That wasn't luck. It was expertise. The word hung in the air between them, expertise. It was a word that didn't belong to her, not in this uniform. Mr. Davies' face flushed a deep, mottled red. He pointed a trembling finger at her. That's it. I've had enough of your attitude. You're off the floor, effective immediately. You'll be on room service detail for the rest of the week in the South Wing, far away from the executive suites. It was a demotion, a banishment. He was putting her in a gilded cage, ensuring she would be nowhere near the second, more critical phase of the negotiations. The formal contract review was scheduled for the next morning in one of the penthouse conference rooms. I don't want to see you anywhere near Mr. Sterling or his guests again, he finished, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. If I so much as hear that you've breathed in their direction, you'll be out of here so fast your head will spin. Do I make myself clear? Crystal, Imani said. She turned without another word and walked out, leaving him standing in the sterile silence of his tiny kingdom. As she walked toward the staff locker room, she felt the anger finally begin to surface, a cold, clean fire. It wasn't the humiliation that angered her most. It was the waste. They had a $500 million deal on the line, a deal that hinged on precise, culturally fluent communication, and they were benching the only person in the building who was truly qualified to navigate it. She knew what was in those contracts. She knew the linguistic traps, the subtle clauses, the deliberate ambiguities that could be weaponized in the fine print. David, the translator, would be a lamb led to slaughter. Sterling, for all his bluster, was flying blind. The real battle wasn't over a metaphorical dragon boat. It was about to be fought in the dense, treacherous jungle of legalese, and the one person who knew the terrain had just been ordered to stay behind. The south wing of the Wellington Grand was a world away from the vibrant, high-stakes theater of the main dining room. Here, the hallways were longer, the silence deeper, the luxury more subdued. For 2 days, this was Imani's exile. Her world shrank to the dimensions of a rattling room service cart, the hushed interiors of guest suites, and brief, impersonal interactions that required little more than a polite nod. She delivered club sandwiches at midnight and pots of coffee at dawn, moving through the hotel like a phantom, her true capabilities locked away like state secrets. She tried not to think about the negotiations happening in the penthouse suites above. She tried to focus on the mundane rhythm of her work, the precise placement of a jam pot on a breakfast tray, the perfect fold of a napkin. But her mind, restless and analytical, kept replaying the scene with Sterling and Mr. Chen, dissecting the linguistic and cultural failures with academic precision. She knew the deal was on life support, and she suspected the worst was yet to come. The summons arrived on Wednesday morning, crackling over the service radio. It was Mr. Davies, his voice tight with reluctance. Williams, we have a priority coffee service request for the Celestial Suite conference room. Penthouse level. The regular attendant is on break. You're the only one available. Get up there. Now. Imani's heart gave a single hard thump against her ribs. The Celestial Suite. She knew it was where Sterling's team was meeting Mr. Chen for the final contract review. Davies was being forced, by the simple logistics of hotel operations to send the one person he'd banished directly back into the line of fire. The irony was not lost on her. "Understood," she replied, her voice calm. 15 minutes later, she was pushing her cart out of the service elevator onto the penthouse floor. The air up here was different, thinner, smelling of rarefied power. She could hear the tense, muffled murmur of voices from behind the grand double doors of the conference room. Taking a steadying breath, she gave a soft, professional knock. A junior analyst opened the door, his face pale and strained. He barely glanced at her, just gestured her inside toward a mahogany sideboard. The scene was worse than she'd imagined. The room felt like a strategic command center on the verge of collapse. Architectural plans were spread across one end of a long table, while stacks of legal documents sat at the other. Arthur Sterling was pacing near the window, his back to the room, his shoulders rigid. Mr. Chen and his associates were seated, their faces impassive, stone-like. And in the middle of it all was David, the translator, looking as if he were single-handedly trying to hold back a tsunami with a teaspoon. Amani moved with quiet efficiency, setting down the silver carafes of coffee, the pitchers of iced water and the small plates of pastries no one would eat. She was a ghost again, her presence meant to be felt only in the comfort she provided, not in the space she occupied. But her ears, finely tuned and fluent, were taking in everything. They were stuck on Clause 12b, intellectual property. "As you can see," Sterling's lawyer was saying, his tone painstakingly patient, "the clause outlines the terms for our joint IP development. All patents and trademarks created through the partnership will be co-owned." David, the translator, took a deep breath and began to speak. Amani, pouring coffee, heard the Mandarin words form in the air and felt a jolt of pure, cold dread. David was using the term women gongtang de Kachin. It was a fatally incorrect choice. Kachin meant property, assets, possessions, something tangible that one party owns. It completely missed the abstract, collaborative nature of intellectual property rights. The correct term would have been something like Lianhe Yangyu de Jishi Chengquan, jointly held intellectual property. To Mr. Chen, David's translation didn't sound like a proposal for a partnership. It sounded like a brazen, insulting declaration that Sterling's company intended to take co-ownership of Mr. Chen's existing, highly valuable technology portfolio. It was an act of corporate colonialism disguised as a handshake. Amani watched Mr. Chen's hand, which had been resting on his teacup, slowly clench into a fist. One of his associates leaned in and whispered something to him, his eyes flashing with anger. The temperature in the room plunged. Sterling, oblivious to the linguistic disaster, pressed on. "We see this as the cornerstone of our collaboration, a true merging of our assets." When David translated the word assets using Zichin, another term for tangible property, it was the final straw. Mr. Chen held up a hand, silencing everyone. He spoke in a voice that was lethally calm. His words were directed at Sterling, but his cold, disappointed gaze was fixed on the translator. Amani didn't need to wait for the translation. She understood perfectly. "This conversation is no longer productive," Mr. Chen had said. "You have fundamentally misunderstood the nature of respect. This is not a merger of assets. It is a partnership of ideas. Clearly, you are not prepared for such a relationship. We are finished here." David, looking terrified, offered a pale, watered-down version. "Mr. Chen has some serious concerns about the clause. He feels we are not on the same page." "Concerns?" Sterling boomed, his frustration boiling over. "We're offering him a golden opportunity. What's not to be on the same page about?" Amani stood by the sideboard, the silver coffee pot clutched in her hand. Her knuckles were white. This was it. This was the catastrophic failure she had anticipated. She'd been warned, demoted, and threatened with termination if she so much as breathed in their direction. To speak now would be professional suicide. Mr. Davies would have her escorted from the building before she finished her first sentence. But as she watched, Mr. Chen's associates began to close their leather portfolios with quiet, final snaps. She knew she couldn't stay silent. This wasn't just about a business deal anymore. It was about the integrity of language, about the profound injustice of a failure born not of malice, but of sheer, arrogant incompetence. It was about truth. And the truth in this room had only one voice. Chaos bloomed in the celestial suite. Sterling's face was a mask of disbelief and rage. "What do you mean he's leaving? David, fix this." He roared at the translator, who looked as if he was about to faint. Mr. Chen was already on his feet, his associates rising with him in a silent, unified wave of departure. They moved toward the door with the unhurried, resolute pace of men who had made a final decision. The $500 million legacy was walking out the door. Imani stood by the sideboard, a silent witness to the implosion. Her mind was a whirlwind of calculations. To speak was to be fired. To remain silent was to be a coward. Mr. Davies' threat echoed in her ears. "If I so much as hear that you've breathed in their direction." But the words of her professor echoed louder. Language is a room. And right now, everyone was trapped in the wrong room, about to set the whole house on fire. She saw Alex, the junior associate, standing helplessly by his chair, his face ashen. His laptop was open in front of him, a blinking cursor on a blank screen mocking his inaction. In that instant, a plan, desperate and wildly audacious, formed in her mind. She picked up her tray. "More coffee, gentlemen?" she asked, her voice a placid island in the stormy room. No one responded, their attention fixed on the slow-motion disaster at the door. She moved toward the table, her steps measured and calm. Her path would take her directly behind Alex. As she approached, she deliberately listed as if her foot had caught on the thick carpet. The tray tilted. A few drops of coffee sloshed from a cup, landing perilously close to Alex's laptop. "Oh, I am so sorry," she whispered, setting the tray down and pulling a clean napkin from her apron. The small, manufactured crisis gave her the perfect excuse to lean in close, her body shielding his screen from the view of Sterling and the others. "So clumsy of me," she murmured, dabbing at the non-existent spill with one hand. With the other, her fingers flew over his keyboard. It was a gamble of breathtaking proportions. She typed into the open document on his screen, her movements swift and sure from years of touch-typing academic papers. The message was short, dense with information. A linguistic emergency broadcast. Fatal translation error. He thinks you're trying to steal his intellectual property. The term used, Kachin, means tangible assets. He's deeply insulted. Correct IT now. Tell Sterling to offer a collaborative innovation framework. Use the exact phrase, chunks and heizhuokangjia. She finished just as Mr. Chen reached the door. She straightened up, napkin in hand, and gave Alex a quick, apologetic nod before retreating, her heart a frantic bird beating against her ribs. She had done it. She had thrown the stone. Now all she could do was wait for the ripple. Alex stared at the words that had materialized on his screen. His eyes widened, first in confusion, then in dawning, electric comprehension. The specific Pinean was the key. It was a signal of absolute fluency, a password into a conversation he'd been locked out of. He saw Mr. Chen's hand reach for the doorknob. "Wait!" Alex's voice cut through the room, sharper and more commanding than anyone had ever heard it. Everyone froze. Mr. Chen turned, his expression one of weary impatience. Sterling looked at his associate as if he'd lost his mind. "Please, Mr. Chen," Alex said, standing now, his gaze fixed on the Chinese billionaire. "There has been a grave, a truly unacceptable misunderstanding." He took a breath, his eyes flicking down to his screen for a split second. "We are not speaking of assets, women de Kachin. That was a translation error, a deep one." He then turned to Sterling. "Sir, what we should be proposing is a chunks in heizhuokangjia." He stumbled slightly over the pronunciation, but the words were correct, the tone right. A collaborative innovation framework. The effect was instantaneous. The specific, modern, and perfectly appropriate business term sliced through the tension like a blade. It was the right key for the right lock. Mr. Chen's hand dropped from the doorknob. He tilted his head, a flicker of genuine curiosity in his eyes for the first time in an hour. One of his associates murmured, "That is the correct terminology." The departure was halted. The deal, which had been clinically dead seconds before, now had a faint pulse. Imani watched from the corridor, peering through the crack in the door. She saw the relief flood Sterling's face, quickly followed by confusion. He strode over to Alex, clapping him on the shoulder once the immediate danger had passed, and Mr. Chen had agreed to retake his seat. "Alex, where in God's name did that come from?" Sterling whispered, his voice a mix of awe and suspicion. Imani saw Alex hesitate, his eyes darting toward the door where she had just been. He swallowed. I did some late-night reading on modern Chinese business terminology, sir. In preparation for the meeting, it just came to me. Well, thank God it did, Sterling breathed, already turning his attention back to Mr. Chen, his salesman's smile firmly back in place. You might have just saved this company, son. Imani slipped away before anyone could see her. She glided down the hallway and into the service elevator, her face a blank mask hiding the triumphant, aching turmoil within. She had done it again. She had steered the ship away from the rocks, and someone else was being hailed as the hero. As the elevator doors closed, she looked down at her hands, the hands that cleaned rooms, poured coffee, and had just invisibly rewritten the fate of a $500 million negotiation. The power she held was immense. And for now, it had to remain a complete and utter secret. The fragile peace Imani had brokered from the shadows lasted less than 24 hours. The next morning, the hotel was humming with a nervous, high-strung energy. The final signing of the Sterling-Chen partnership was scheduled for 3:00 p.m. in the Celestial Suite, and the fate of the Wellington Grand, and hundreds of jobs within it, hung in the balance. For Imani, the day began with a stark reminder of her new, diminished reality. Mr. Davies called a mandatory morning briefing for the room service staff. He stood before them, his posture rigid, and announced a new efficiency protocol. To streamline operations, he said, his eyes scanning the group before landing on Imani. Staff assigned to the south and west wings are not to service any floors above the 10th level without direct, in-person authorization from me. This is to ensure our premium guests on the penthouse levels receive only the most senior attendant care. No exceptions. It was a rule created for an audience of one. He was building a wall, brick by verbal brick, to keep her contained. The other staff members exchanged confused glances, but Imani understood perfectly. This was not about efficiency, it was about enforcement. He was tightening the leash, making sure his invisible employee stayed that way. She spent the morning in a frustrating cycle of monotony, delivering trays of eggs Benedict and freshly squeezed orange juice to guests who never made eye contact. The work was simple, mindless, a stark contrast to the complex, high-level analysis her brain was performing on a loop. She kept dissecting the linguistic puzzle of the deal, imagining the treacherous legal phrases in the final contract, the ones David the translator would almost certainly butcher. She knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that the real crisis was yet to come. Around noon, she was pushing her cart down a long, quiet corridor in the south wing when a voice, hushed and urgent, called her name. Imani. She turned. It was Alex, the junior associate. He looked harried, his tie loosened, a sheen of sweat on his brow. He was far from the executive floors, and he was clearly taking a risk just by being here. I need to talk to you, he said, glancing nervously down the empty hall. Can we go in here? He gestured to an empty service alcove. Inside the small space, surrounded by stacks of fresh linens, he got straight to the point. It's falling apart again, he whispered, his voice strained. We're stuck. David is useless, and Sterling is about to blow the whole thing up. Imani's posture tensed. What happened? It's the arbitration clause. 14C, he said, pulling a folded document from his jacket pocket and showing her the highlighted text. Mr. Chen is insisting on Singapore as the neutral territory for any legal disputes. It's a non-negotiable point for him. It's about saving face, showing it's a partnership of equals. Sterling is demanding New York. He sees it as a sign of weakness to concede. Imani scanned the clause. The English was standard. The problem, she knew, would be in the tone of the translation. Sterling gave his final offer, Alex continued, his voice dropping lower. He said it's New York or there's no deal, but David, the way he translated it in Mandarin, it came out sounding like a threat. An ultimatum. I saw the look on Mr. Chen's face. He was personally insulted. He said they will return at 3 o'clock for a final answer, but if the answer is still New York, he will be booking a flight home. Imani closed her eyes. It was exactly as she'd feared. The translator had turned a hard-nosed negotiation tactic into a declaration of war. I need you there, Imani, Alex pleaded, his professional veneer cracking. You're the only one who can fix this. I'll say you're my assistant. I'll say anything. Afterwards, I swear I'll tell Sterling everything you did. You'll get the credit, a promotion, whatever you want. But if this deal dies, we're all sunk." She was trapped, Davy's threat on one side, Alex's desperate plea on the other. Her survival versus her integrity. Before she could answer, a shadow fell over the entrance to the alcove. Williams. Mr. Davies stood there, his face a thundercloud of triumphant fury. He had found them. He didn't know what they were discussing, but the sight of a junior executive conferring secretly with a room service attendant was enough. It was all the proof he needed. "What part of stay away from the guests did you not understand?" he snarled, his eyes flicking from Amani to a now terrified Alex. "And you," he said, pointing a finger at the associate, "have a serious lapse in judgment consorting with the service staff." He grabbed Amani's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "That's it. You're done. I want your uniform and your ID badge on my desk in 5 minutes. You're fired." The words hit her cold and final, fired, for a crime she didn't commit by a man who couldn't see past her uniform. Alex started to protest. "Wait, this is my fault. She was just—" "Save it," Davies cut him off. He shoved Amani lightly toward the hallway. "Go now. Human Resources is waiting for you." It was over. She had been caught, condemned, and cast out. The deal would collapse at 300 p.m., and she would be gone, just another casualty in a war no one knew she was fighting. She began to walk down the long, lonely corridor toward the service elevator, the path of her dismissal. The weight of it all, the injustice, the insults, the wasted potential pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. This was how it ended. But as she reached for the elevator button, her fingers hovering over the cool plastic circle, something inside her shifted. A fire, low and steady, began to burn away the cold dread. She thought of her grandmother. She thought of the promise she'd made to herself. She thought of Mr. Chen's dignified face, twisted by a translator's incompetence. She would not let it end this way. She would not let them shrink her. Amani pulled her hand back from the elevator. She turned, her back straight, her face set with a resolve that was as clear and hard as a diamond. She was not going down to HR. She was going up, to the penthouse, to the celestial suite. The walk from the service corridor to the guest elevators was the longest of Amani's life. Every step was a conscious act of defiance. She passed cleaning carts and bewildered staff members, her pace quickening, her focus narrowing to a single point, the brass-plated call button. She ignored the service elevator, her designated transport to the lower levels, and stabbed the button for the main bank, the ones with velvet ropes and express service to the penthouse. As she stepped into the mirrored, wood-paneled car, she caught her reflection. A woman in a simple, gray and white uniform, her hair pulled back in a neat, functional bun. There was nothing about her appearance that hinted at the fire in her veins or the arsenal of knowledge in her mind. For the first time, she saw the uniform not as a cage but as the perfect camouflage. The elevator opened silently onto the penthouse floor. The air was still, the thick carpets muffling all sound. Down the hall, the double doors to the celestial suite were slightly ajar. She could hear Sterling's voice, loud and frayed with desperation. "Mr. Chen, please, we can find a compromise." A security guard, broad and impassive, stood near the entrance. He saw her approach and immediately held up a hand. "Ma'am, this is a private meeting. You can't be here." Amani didn't break her stride. "There is a miscommunication in that room that is about to cost this hotel its most important partnership," she said, her voice low and imbued with an authority that made the guard pause. "If I don't go in there right now, the damage will be permanent. You can explain to Mr. Sterling why you let me in, or you can explain to him why you let $500 million walk out the door. The choice is yours." She didn't wait for his answer. She pushed past him and strode through the doors. The scene was exactly as she'd pictured. Mr. Chen and his associates were standing, briefcases in hand, their backs to the table. Sterling was red-faced, his hands spread in a gesture of frantic appeal. David, the translator, was stammering, trying to translate Sterling's pleas into a language he had already proven he didn't truly understand. The deal was over. The handshakes were being retracted. Her entrance was a detonation of silence. Every head turned. Sterling's face, already contorted with anger, darkened into a mask of pure fury when he saw her. "You," he roared, pointing a trembling finger. "What in the hell are you doing here? I thought you were fired. Security, get her out of my sight. The guard stepped forward, but before he could reach her, Imani did the one thing no one in the room could have ever anticipated. She ignored Arthur Sterling completely. Her gaze locked with Mr. Chen's, and she gave a slight, respectful bow from the neck. And then she spoke. Her voice, clear and resonant, filled the room, not with the soft Georgia lilt Sterling had mocked, but with the crisp, formal tones of perfect academic Mandarin. Shane Ziansheng, King Yuan Liang Women Dewuji, she began. Mr. Chen, please forgive our misunderstanding. The room stopped breathing. Sterling's jaw went slack. The security guard froze mid-step. David, the translator's face went from pale to the color of ash. Mr. Chen, who had been turning to leave, stopped, his body going utterly still. His expression of cold finality was shattered, replaced by one of profound, unadulterated shock. Imani continued, her Mandarin flowing with the effortless grace of a master calligrapher's brush. Shi Diling Ziansheng de Jiji, Jishi Fanny Budang de Buxing Haoguo, Ta de Zhenjiang Yidu, Shizai Women Liang Guo de Shanghai Wayne Hajai Jian Jianli Yizuo Kaio Liang, Air Bushi Yasai. Mr. Sterling's directness was merely the unfortunate consequence of a poor translation. His true intention is to build a bridge between our two business cultures, not a fortress. She had not only spoken, she had understood. She had identified the core issue, the insult, the lack of respect, and reframed it with a powerful diplomatic metaphor. The word bridge hung in the air, a symbol of everything the negotiation was supposed to be. Mr. Chen slowly turned to face her fully, his eyes, sharp and analytical, studying her as if seeing her for the first time. He replied in the same formal Mandarin, his tone laced with disbelief. Nin de yong sai jai jingjun, ru zai yiban, fei fu wai an suo nang jai, nin judging shi shei. You speak with the nuance of a scholar, not a waitress. Who are you? Sterling, now completely lost, spun toward his translator. What did he say? What is she saying, David? David could only shake his head, speechless. Imani answered for him, switching to flawless, unaccented English as she turned to Sterling. Mr. Chen is asking who I am, sir. The act of translating for them, of seamlessly moving between their two worlds, instantly and irrevocably shifted the power in the room. She was no longer a servant. She was the conduit. Sterling stared at her, his mind visibly struggling to reconcile the woman he'd humiliated with the poised, multilingual powerhouse standing before him. Who are you? He stammered. Imani held his gaze. All the years of being overlooked, of being underestimated, of swallowing her frustration, culminated in this one quiet moment of truth. The mask was off. My name is Imani Williams, she said, her voice steady and clear. I have a PhD in East Asian linguistics from Fudan University, and I am the only person on your team who has understood this conversation from the very beginning. Imani's words landed in the center of the celestial suite with the force of a physical impact. The air, already thin with tension, seemed to evacuate the room entirely. For a long, suspended moment, there was only a ringing silence, thick with the debris of shattered assumptions. Arthur Sterling stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape, the furious command for security dying on his lips. David, the translator, looked as though he had seen a ghost, his face a canvas of pure, unadulterated shame. Then a sound broke the stillness. It was a laugh. Short, sharp, and utterly genuine. Mr. Chen, who had been a statue of offended dignity, threw his head back and let out a bark of rich, appreciative laughter. It was the sound of a master chess player witnessing an opponent make a move so unexpected, so brilliant, it changed the entire board. The tension in the room didn't just break, it evaporated. With a simple, elegant gesture of his hand, he waved his associates back from the door. They retook their seats, their expressions a mixture of awe and intense curiosity as they all stared at Imani. Mr. Chen's gaze settled on her, and for the first time, it was not the polite, distant look of a businessman assessing a deal, but the sharp, respectful focus of one intellectual recognizing another. He gestured to the empty, high-backed leather chair beside his own. Wai Lian Musi Boshi, he said, his voice now warm, using her newly revealed title. Dr. Williams, please join us. It was not a request. It was an invitation to power. Imani walked from the doorway to the head of the table, her steps steady. She pulled out the chair and sat. The simple act was a tectonic shift. She was no longer a servant on the periphery. She was now at the geographic and strategic center of a $500 million negotiation. Sterling watched this unfold, his face a kaleidoscope of conflicting emotions, humiliation, confusion, and a dawning, horrified respect. He was no longer in control of his own meeting. He had become a spectator. Mr. Chen turned his body slightly, angling it away from Sterling to face Imani directly. He began speaking in Mandarin, his words now fluid and complex, a torrent of legal and cultural nuance he had clearly been holding back. Sterling, utterly lost, did the one thing he had never had to do in his entire professional life. He leaned toward the man he had just tried to fire and asked, his voice a humbled whisper, "David, what is he saying?" But David could only shake his head, his expertise so thoroughly eclipsed he had been rendered mute. Imani listened patiently until Mr. Chen finished. Then she turned to Sterling, her expression professional, her voice even. "Mr. Chen is expressing his profound disappointment in the translation of the arbitration clause," she said, her English as crisp and clear as her Mandarin. "He says that your insistence on New York felt like a unilateral demand, ignoring the partnership's need for a foundation of mutual respect. He confirms that jurisdiction in a neutral, respected Asian hub like Singapore is, for him, a matter of principle." She then turned back to Mr. Chen and replied in Mandarin, her tone both respectful and firm. She didn't just translate, she negotiated. She explained the American legal perspective on home turf jurisdiction while validating his principled stance on neutrality. She was building the bridge she had spoken of, plank by plank, right there at the table. "What did you tell him?" Sterling asked, now reduced to the role of a client asking his lawyer for an update. "I suggested a compromise," Imani said, not taking her eyes off Mr. Chen. "A hybrid model. All initial dispute mediations to be held via video conference, co-chaired by arbitrators from both New York and Singapore. Should it require a physical hearing, the location will be determined by a pre-agreed upon neutral third party in Geneva. It removes the home field advantage for both sides and reinforces the spirit of a truly global partnership." It was a brilliant, elegant solution. It offered both sides a victory while demanding a concession, the very essence of masterful diplomacy. Mr. Chen considered it for a moment, then a slow, broad smile spread across his face. He nodded once. "Wo Tongyi," he said, "I agree." He then looked at Sterling and said in clear, deliberate English, "She is very good." The deal was done. In the space of 10 minutes, Imani Williams had resurrected a dead negotiation and fortified it with a foundation of genuine understanding. The room exhaled. Alex, the junior associate, looked at Imani with something akin to hero worship. Even Sterling's own legal counsel seemed to be looking at her with grudging admiration. It was Sterling who finally moved. He stood up, his 6'4" frame seeming somehow smaller than it had an hour ago. He smoothed his tie, a gesture that couldn't hide the tremor in his hands. He looked at Mr. Chen, then at his associates. "Mr. Chen," he began, his voice raspy with emotion, "please accept my deepest apologies. Not for the failures of our equipment," he said, gesturing vaguely at the shell-shocked translator, "but for my own ignorance, my own arrogance." He then did something even more shocking. He turned to face Imani directly in front of the silent, watching delegations. "Dr. Williams," he said, the title tasting strange and new in his mouth. "I was wrong. My behavior earlier was not just unprofessional, it was inexcusable. You possess more grace, skill, and integrity than anyone in this room, myself included. I am profoundly in your debt." The public apology, raw and unequivocal, hung in the air. It was a complete and total surrender. The man who had mocked her accent was now praising her character before an audience of his peers. Mr. Chen stood and offered his hand, but he didn't offer it to Sterling. He extended it across the table to Imani. "Heizuo Yukahe," he said with a warm smile, "a pleasure to partner with you." Imani stood and shook his hand, her grip firm. "Heizuo Yukahe." After Mr. Chen and his delegation departed, their handshakes firm and their smiles genuine, an entirely new kind of silence descended upon the celestial suite. Sterling's team, murmuring in a mixture of relief and astonishment, filed out of the room, leaving a trail of quiet congratulations for a victory none of them truly understood. Soon, only Arthur Sterling and Amani Williams remained, standing on opposite sides of the long mahogany table, the debris of the near disaster scattered between them like the aftermath of a battle. The silence was thick with unspoken words, with the ghosts of insults and the raw, recent memory of a world turned upside down. Sterling, a man accustomed to commanding any room he entered, now seemed adrift in his own penthouse suite. He loosened his tie, a gesture of profound exhaustion, and walked over to the mahogany sideboard where Amani had, hours or perhaps a lifetime ago, set down the coffee. "Can I?" he began, his voice raspy, unfamiliar. "Can I get you something? Water, coffee. Something stronger. God knows I need something stronger." He didn't look at her as he spoke, busying himself by pouring 2 glasses of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. He was breaking the established order, the fundamental dynamic of their relationship. The billionaire was offering to serve the waitress. Amani remained where she was. "I'm fine, thank you." He nodded, taking a large swallow from his glass before turning to face her. His eyes, which had previously held either cruel amusement or panicked rage, were now stripped bare, revealing a deep, unsettling well of shame. "I don't even know where to begin," he said, his voice low. He walked back to the table but didn't sit, instead running a hand over the polished wood. "The things I said, the way I treated you, it wasn't just about an accent, was it?" He looked up and his gaze was a direct, unflinching question. "When I looked at you, I didn't see a person. I didn't see someone with a history, an education, a mind. I saw a uniform, and I am so deeply ashamed of that." This was not the performative apology from before, the one delivered for the benefit of his business partners. This was a confession, raw and painful. Amani listened, her expression unreadable, her posture still, granting him the space to unravel his own profound failure. "My entire life has been about building things, controlling outcomes," he continued, his voice cracking slightly. "When I feel that control slipping, I lash out. I find a target to feel powerful again. It's not an excuse, it's a flaw. A deep flaw in my character, and you were the one who had to pay the price for it." Amani was silent for a long moment, letting his words settle in the quiet room. When she finally spoke, her voice was not accusatory but analytical, as if she were diagnosing a complex problem. "The apology is one thing, Mr. Sterling," she said softly. "Understanding why you needed to make it is another. It seems you're beginning to do that." He let out a breath that sounded suspiciously like a sob. "How could I have been so blind?" "For years," Amani said, her gaze drifting toward the window that overlooked the sprawling city. "I've carried my qualifications like a secret, a hidden language. I learned to present a simpler version of myself to the world because I was afraid it wouldn't know what to do with the real me. It's exhausting, living a double life. What you saw as a simple waitress was my camouflage." The word camouflage struck him. He had been so certain of the world he saw, he never once considered he was only seeing a carefully constructed surface. "Feuden University," he said, the name of the prestigious institution a testament to his own ignorance. "A PhD. Tell me, please. I feel like I need to understand the person I failed so completely to see." So she told him, not her whole life story but the relevant chapters. The scholarship that had been her ticket out of a life of limited expectations. The initial culture shock in Shanghai, followed by a deep and abiding love for the language, the history, the intricate dance of a culture so different from her own. She spoke of her passion for building bridges, for being a human conduit between worlds. And she spoke of the crushing disillusionment of returning to America, armed with a world-class education and fluent in the most sought-after business language on the planet, only to be met with hundreds of rejections. Her resume dismissed, her potential unseen, until she had no choice but to take a job serving men like him just to keep the lights on. He listened, his head bowed, the glass of whiskey forgotten in his hand. Each word was a fresh indictment of his own lack of vision. When she finished, he was silent for a long time. Finally, he looked up, his eyes clear now with a new, painful kind of certainty. "This company," he said, his voice firm, This hotel, we don't just have a communication problem, we have a systemic blindness. The issue wasn't just one bad translator. It's me. It's a corporate culture that looks at a uniform and stops seeing the person. I need you to help me fix it." Imani watched him, her expression cautious. "This isn't about me offering you a job as a translator," he continued, stepping towards her. "That would be an insult. This is about you leading a fundamental change. I want to create a new position. For you, Director of Cross-Cultural Relations. It wouldn't be a token title. It would be a senior role on my executive team with the budget and the authority to rebuild our entire international strategy. More than that, to build a system that finds the other Imanis in this company, to ensure no one with your kind of talent is ever invisible here again." The offer was vast, audacious. It was more than a job, it was a form of restitution. It was a chance to turn her pain into policy. She didn't answer right away. She looked at this man, so profoundly humbled, a titan of industry brought to his knees not by a market crash, but by his own prejudice. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, but she also saw the long, hard road ahead. "And what," she asked, her voice quiet but strong, "would that change look like, Mr. Sterling?" Imani met Arthur Sterling's question with a thoughtful silence, letting it hang in the air between them. What would that change look like? He was offering her a title, a seat at the table. But she wasn't interested in a promotion. She was interested in a revolution, albeit a quiet one. "It would look like a company that invests in its own people first," she began, her voice steady, no longer the hushed tone of a waitress but the clear, measured cadence of a strategist. "It would mean that cultural literacy is not an elective, but a core competency for every executive who represents this brand. It would mean that performance reviews include metrics on empathy and inclusivity, not just profit margins." She took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. "And it would mean creating a formal, funded initiative to identify and nurture the overlooked talent that I know is in this building. The busboys who are studying engineering at night, the housekeepers who speak 3 languages, the kitchen staff who could run their own restaurants. I've met them. I've worked alongside them. They are your company's greatest untapped resource." She paused, letting the weight of her vision settle. "I will accept your offer, Mr. Sterling, on one condition, that you provide the seed funding for a new pilot program. We'll call it the Hidden Talent Initiative. Its sole purpose will be to build bridges from the service floors to the executive suites." Sterling didn't hesitate. The man who had once demanded she repeat a word for his amusement now listened as if her words were scripture. A genuine, unforced respect had taken root in his eyes. "Done," he said, his voice thick with a conviction she had never heard from him before. "Whatever you need. The budget is yours. You are the architect of this change, Dr. Williams. We will follow your blueprint." A week later, a new nameplate was affixed to a door on the 35th floor, the executive level. The polished brass read, Imani Williams, Ph.D. Director of Cross-Cultural Relations. The inclusion of her academic title was non-negotiable, a quiet but firm reclamation of the identity he had tried to erase. Her new office was spacious and minimalist, with a commanding view of the East River. But the most prominent feature was a simple, black-framed object hanging on the wall opposite her desk. It was the wine list from the restaurant downstairs, open to the page with the word Gewürztraminer. She had asked the manager, a now deeply humbled Mr. Davies, for it. He had given it to her without a word, his face a mixture of shame and awe. It was not a trophy. It was a reminder, a symbol of a humiliation she had transformed into a foundation. Her first official act was not to call a meeting with the board, but to walk downstairs. She bypassed the guest elevators and took the service car down to the basement levels, the rumbling, utilitarian box that had once been her domain. She walked through the bustling kitchens, the steamy laundry rooms, the long, fluorescent-lit corridors of the hotel's underbelly. But this time, she was not invisible. The staff stopped what they were doing, their faces breaking into smiles of recognition and pride. They had all heard the story. To them, she wasn't just an executive. She was one of their own, a quiet warrior who had spoken for all of them. She didn't make a grand speech. She simply listened. She spoke with a dishwasher from El Salvador who dreamed of getting his accounting degree. She had a conversation in flawless Russian with a housekeeper from St. Petersburg who had been a history professor in her former life. She talked to a young valet who was a self-taught coder, building apps on his phone during his breaks. With each conversation, she took notes. Not as a boss, but as a mentor and advocate. She was mapping the hidden brilliance of the Wellington Grand. Late in the afternoon, she ran into David, the translator. He was collecting his final paycheck from HR, his face drawn and pale. He flinched when he saw her, expecting a look of triumph or scorn. Instead, Imani offered him a small, compassionate smile. "I heard you're fluent in French as well, David," she said gently. "The concierge desk has been looking for a multilingual liaison for our European guests. It's a role that requires precision, but not the same kind of pressure. Perhaps you should apply." He stared at her, stunned. "Why would you after what happened?" "Because my goal is to put people in the right rooms," she said, "including you." That evening, Imani stood in her new office, the city lights beginning to sparkle across the river. On her desk was a legal pad filled with names, the first dozen candidates for the Hidden Talent Initiative. Each name was a story, a universe of potential that had, until now, been completely overlooked. She looked at the framed wine list on her wall, the word a silent testament to her journey. Her grandmother had told her not to let anyone shrink her down to their size. Now, she finally had the space, the power, and the purpose to help others grow to their full and magnificent stature. The work was just beginning. But for the first time, she was building a room big enough for everyone. The first session of the Cultural Literacy and Dignity in Service workshop was not held in a grand ballroom, but in a functional, sunlit conference room on the 5th floor. The choice of venue was deliberate. This was not a lecture from on high. It was a working session, a place to roll up their sleeves and begin the difficult, necessary labor of unlearning. The attendees were a cross-section of the Wellington Grand's management, heads of concierge, food and beverage, security, and housekeeping. They sat around a large circular table, name tags and fresh notepads placed neatly before them. And in the front row, looking deeply and profoundly uncomfortable, was Mr. Davies. His attendance was mandatory. He sat stiffly in his chair, his eyes fixed on the blank screen at the front of the room, avoiding Imani's gaze. Imani stood at the lectern, not behind it, but beside it. She wore a simple, elegant navy dress, her presence calm and authoritative. She waited for the quiet murmurs to die down, then began. "Good morning," she said, her voice filling the room with a quiet warmth. "A few weeks ago in this very hotel, a $500 million partnership nearly collapsed. It wasn't because of a flawed business model or a lack of resources. It was because of a single misunderstood word." She let that sink in, her eyes making brief contact with each person in the room. "That failure," she continued, "was not the fault of one person. It was the result of a culture. A culture that, for all its attention to five-star details, had learned to stop seeing the most valuable asset it possessed, the whole, complete person behind the uniform. We saw a role, not a human being. We heard an accent, not a history. Today, we begin the work of changing that." Mr. Davies shifted in his seat, his knuckles white where he gripped his pen. Imani clicked to her first slide. It was a simple question: "What is your hidden talent?" "We're going to start with a simple exercise," she announced. "On the notepad in front of you, I want you to write down one skill, one passion, or one piece of knowledge you possess that has absolutely nothing to do with your job title." A ripple of confusion went through the room. She gave them a moment, then smiled. "For example," she said, "the lead valet on our evening shift is a classically trained pianist. One of our sous chefs is fluent in Farsi. And until a few weeks ago, a member of our housekeeping staff held a PhD in East Asian linguistics." The direct, matter-of-fact way she stated it, without a trace of bitterness, was more powerful than any accusation. It was simply a fact, an example of a resource the organization had possessed, but failed to recognize. For the next hour, she guided them through a meticulously planned curriculum. She presented the Sterling Chen negotiation as a case study, breaking down the specific linguistic and cultural errors. She explained the dragon boat metaphor, the catastrophic difference between Kachin assets and Jishi Chengquan intellectual property rights. She turned the chaotic, high-stakes drama they had only heard whispers of into a clear, teachable moment about the tangible cost of cultural ignorance. Then came the role-playing. "All right," Imani said, her tone shifting to one of practical application. "Let's walk through a scenario. Mr. Davies, if you would." Davies looked up, startled, like a student caught sleeping in class. "Imagine," Imani said, her gaze direct but not unkind, "that a high-profile guest from Brazil is at the front desk, visibly distressed. He's lost his passport and he's struggling to explain the situation in broken English. The concierge is becoming flustered. Then, a member of your housekeeping staff who is cleaning the lobby nearby steps forward and begins speaking to the guest in fluent, calming Portuguese. As a manager, observing this scene, what is your immediate response?" The question was a scalpel, precise and aimed directly at the heart of their past encounter. The entire room was silent, watching him. This was a test, and everyone knew it. Davies' face was slick with sweat. He cleared his throat. The old Davies, the man from the windowless office, would have had a swift, punishing answer, reprimand the employee for overstepping. But that man was being asked to die in this very chair. "I would," he began, his voice raspy. He swallowed, then started again, looking at Imani. "I would first ensure the guest's needs were being met. Then I would thank the employee for her initiative, and I would make a formal note in her file about her linguistic skill so that we could utilize it in the future." "Excellent," Imani said with a simple, affirming nod. There was no gloating, no hint of "I told you so." There was only grace. "You see the solution, not the transgression. You see the asset, not the audacity. That is the entire goal. Thank you, Mr. Davies." He slumped back in his chair, looking as if he'd just run a marathon. By the end of the 3-hour session, the atmosphere in the room had transformed. The initial skepticism had been replaced by a genuine, thoughtful engagement. They were not just managers anymore. They were a team grappling with a vital, shared challenge. As they filed out, many of them stopped to thank Imani personally. Mr. Davies was the last to leave. He approached the lectern where she was gathering her notes, his usual bluster gone, replaced by a raw, uncertain humility. "Dr. Williams," he said, the title no longer feeling foreign to him. It was very insightful. I learned a great deal. Thank you." "We're all learning, Mr. Davies," Imani replied, offering him a small, genuine smile. "That's the point." He nodded once, then turned and left. Imani stood alone in the quiet conference room, looking at the circle of empty chairs. She hadn't sought revenge. She had sought to build a bridge. And today, the first stubborn, difficult cornerstone had been laid. True power, she realized, wasn't about proving someone else wrong. It was about creating a culture where more people had the opportunity to be right. The cultural literacy workshops were just the beginning. For Imani, they were about repairing a damaged foundation. The Hidden Talent Initiative was about building something entirely new upon it. Her office on the 35th floor quickly transformed from a quiet executive suite into a vibrant hub of possibility. The initial staff surveys had yielded a treasure trove of overlooked skills, a database of human potential that had been lying dormant beneath the hotel's polished surface. She spent her days moving between two worlds. In the mornings, she would meet with Sterling and the executive team, discussing strategy and budgets. In the afternoons, she would walk the service corridors, not as a director, but as a listener, an archaeologist of forgotten dreams. Her first major discovery wasn't from a survey. It was from observation. She noticed Marco, a quiet young buzzboy in the hotel's brasserie, who spent every single one of his breaks hunched over a battered, second-hand laptop in a corner of the employee cafeteria. He was always so engrossed, his fingers flying across the keyboard, that he never seemed to notice the noise around him. One afternoon, she approached his table with 2 cups of coffee. "Mind if I join you?" He looked up, startled, and quickly tried to close his laptop. "I'm sorry, Dr. Williams, I'm on my break." "I know," she said, sitting down. "I'm not here as a director. I'm here because I'm curious." "What are you working on so intently?" Hesitantly, he turned the screen towards her. It was filled with lines of elegant, complex Python code. "It's just a personal project," he mumbled. "I'm teaching myself to code. I'm trying to build a better inventory management system for the brasserie. The one we have is slow." Imani looked at the code, then back at the young man. He couldn't have been more than 20. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, but also a brilliant, determined spark. "Marco," she said gently, "how would you like to build something bigger?" Her next discovery came from a formal application. A woman named Alina, a housekeeper in her late 50s who had been with the hotel for over a decade, had shyly submitted her information. Her hidden talent, a master's degree in Russian art history from the University of Moscow. She was a quiet, dignified woman who did her work flawlessly, but had long since resigned herself to a life of invisibility. Imani invited Alina to her office. "Your background is incredible," Imani said, looking at the photocopied diploma. "Why have you never mentioned this?" Alina shrugged, a sad, familiar gesture of resignation. "Who would I mention it to? My job is to clean rooms. In this country, my degree is just a story I tell myself. It has no value here." "I disagree," Imani said, leaning forward. "I think its value is simply in the wrong currency. Let's change that." A week later, Imani stood before Arthur Sterling in his office, a two-pronged proposal in her hands. "Marco, the buzzboy, is a coding prodigy," she began. "Our official guest services app is clunky and has a 2-star rating. I propose we give Marco a 3-month paid fellowship, reporting directly to our IT department to develop a new prototype. We give him the tools, the mentorship, and a real problem to solve. If he succeeds, we hire him. If he fails, we've still invested in one of our own." Sterling listened, intrigued. "And the housekeeper?" "Alina is not a housekeeper. She is a scholar," Imani corrected gently. "Our high-end tourism packages are generic. Every luxury hotel offers the same thing. I propose we create a new, ultra-premium experience, the Wellington Scholars Tour. Alina will lead private, expert-level tours of the city's art museums for our Russian-speaking VIP guests. We'll market it as an exclusive cultural experience. We turn her hidden talent into a unique, revenue-generating asset." Sterling leaned back in his chair, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face. He looked at Imani with pure admiration. "My God," he said, "I thought this initiative was about morale. I was wrong. This is about innovation. You're not just finding people, you're creating value. This is brilliant." He stamped his approval on both proposals without a single change. The ripple effect was almost immediate. When the memo announced Marco's paid fellowship, a shockwave of hope went through the service staff. When Alina, dressed in a smart new uniform provided by the concierge department, was seen leading a rapt group of Russian oligarchs through the Met, the shockwave turned into a current of belief. Suddenly, the line outside Imani's office grew. Employees who had been too shy or too cynical to submit their information were now coming forward. A laundress who was a certified horticulturist was reassigned to the hotel's prestigious gardens. A security guard who had a background in event planning was asked to co-manage the upcoming holiday gala. The cultural fabric of the hotel was being rewoven, thread by thread. The old, rigid hierarchy began to soften, replaced by a new sense of shared enterprise. In the employee cafeteria, the invisible lines separating departments began to blur. Marco was now regularly seen sketching app designs on napkins with the head of IT. Alina was having coffee with the head of guest experiences, animatedly discussing the nuances of Fabergé eggs. From her office, Imani watched the change. She was not just giving people new jobs, she was giving them back their own identities. She was reminding them that their worth was not defined by their title, but by the sum of their whole, complex, brilliant selves. A building's foundation, she reflected, wasn't the marble in its lobby, but the connections between the people within its walls. And for the first time, the Wellington Grand was building something truly strong. 6 months passed. Autumn bled into a crisp, bright winter, and the Wellington Grand continued its quiet metamorphosis. The changes Imani had set in motion were no longer radical experiments. They were the new, celebrated standard. Marco's guest services app, launched a month prior, was a resounding success, streamlining everything from room service to spa bookings and earning rave reviews from guests. He was now a full-time junior developer in the IT department, his buzzboy uniform a distant memory. Alina's Scholars Tours were booked months in advance, becoming a signature offering that set the Wellington apart from its competitors. Her lectures on Russian art were so popular that the hotel had begun hosting them in one of the smaller ballrooms. The Hidden Talent Initiative had become the cornerstone of the hotel's brand, a story the marketing department now told with pride. The ripple had become a wave, and Amani was no longer just a director. She was the respected architect of a cultural renaissance. The news of Mr. Chen's return arrived not with the frantic, high-stakes anxiety of his first visit, but with the warm anticipation of a valued partner's arrival. He was coming to New York for the first official board meeting of the newly formed joint venture. When his motorcade pulled up to the grand entrance, Arthur Sterling was there to greet him. But this time, he was not alone. Amani stood beside him, not behind him, her presence a quiet testament to her integral role in the partnership. Mr. Chen stepped out of the car, his face breaking into a genuine, warm smile upon seeing her. He bypassed Sterling for a moment and addressed Amani first, greeting her in respectful Mandarin. "Why Lian Musi Boshi," he said, taking her hand briefly. "Dr. Williams, it is a profound pleasure to see you again. I trust the bridges you are building have strong foundations." "They are getting stronger every day, Mr. Chen," she replied in kind. "Welcome back." The board meeting was a model of efficiency and mutual respect. The reports were positive, the projections optimistic, the partnership was thriving. But it was after the official business had concluded that Mr. Chen requested a private word with Sterling and Amani in the Celestial Suite, the very room where the world had once shattered and been remade. The three of them sat at the long mahogany table, the afternoon sun streaming through the panoramic windows. "Arthur," Mr. Chen began, his tone thoughtful, "our partnership has exceeded all financial expectations, but I must confess, what has impressed me more is the transformation within your organization. The story of what happened in this room is not one I have forgotten." He turned his gaze to Amani. "Dr. Williams, your actions that day were not merely about saving a deal. They were an act of profound integrity. You held a mirror up to a system that was blind, and you did so with grace, not vengeance. That is a rare and powerful form of leadership." Amani felt a warmth spread through her chest. "I only did what I felt was right, Mr. Chen. And that," he said, "is precisely why my company's philanthropic arm has made a decision. We believe that the world needs more people who do what is right, especially when it is difficult." He slid a handsome leather-bound portfolio across the table. "We are establishing a new international scholarship fund. Its purpose will be to provide full funding for underprivileged students who wish to pursue advanced degrees in linguistics and cross-cultural studies, with a focus on East Asian relations." Amani's breath caught in her throat. She could only stare at the portfolio, her mind reeling. "It is a multi-million-dollar commitment over the next 10 years, Mr. Chen continued. "We hope it will foster a new generation of leaders who can navigate the complexities of our globalized world with the kind of skill and empathy you have demonstrated." He paused, his eyes twinkling. "And we have decided there is only one possible name for such a fund. We will be calling it the Amani Williams Bridge Scholarship." The name struck her with the force of a physical blow. Her own name, attached not to a story of humiliation, but to a legacy of opportunity. She thought of her own scholarship, the one that had felt like a golden ticket, and the years of struggle that had followed. Now, she was to be the namesake for a fund that would open that same door for countless others, ensuring that their journey might be a little easier, their talent seen a little sooner. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden. She tried to speak, but no words came. I don't know what to say," she finally whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Mr. Chen smiled gently. "You have already said everything that was necessary, Dr. Williams. In this very room. Now, it is our turn to listen and to act." Sterling, who had been watching this exchange with a look of profound, quiet pride, cleared his throat. "Mr. Chen," he said, his voice full of a humility that was now second nature to him. "On behalf of my company, we would be honored to match your donation. In full." Now it was Amani who looked truly stunned, her gaze shifting between the two powerful men, both of whom had been so profoundly changed by her one brave act. Later that evening, Amani stood in her office, looking out at the glittering tapestry of the city. On her desk lay the first official document from the Foundation, the title in bold, elegant script, the Amani Williams Bridge Scholarship. Seeing her name immortalized in that way was a surreal, deeply moving experience. It was an echo of her struggle, transformed into a song of hope for others. The quiet girl from Savannah, the invisible waitress, the overlooked academic, her story was now a legacy. A year later, Amani sat in a sun-drenched corner of the main dining room at the Wellington Grand, the very room that had been the stage for her humiliation. The light streamed through the tall, arched windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, golden possibilities. The restaurant was alive with the gentle clinking of silverware and the quiet hum of lunchtime conversations. It was a symphony she had once conducted from the shadows, but today she was a guest. Across from her sat Keisha, a bright, sharp-eyed young woman with a smile that was still a little shy, a little awed. Keisha was a server here now, working the lunch shift, but in the evenings she was a student at Columbia University, majoring in international relations. She was also the inaugural recipient of the Amani Williams Bridge Scholarship. "I still read the email sometimes," Keisha said, her hands wrapped around a glass of water. "The one that said I'd been selected. I thought it was a mistake. People like me. We don't get opportunities like this." "People like us are exactly who these opportunities are for," Amani corrected gently. "The scholarship just opened the door, Keisha. You're the one who is walking through it with so much grace." Keisha ducked her head, a blush rising on her cheeks. "I'm taking my first Mandarin course next semester. It's hard," she admitted with a laugh. "But every time I feel like quitting, I think of your story. It reminds me what's possible." In Keisha, Amani saw a reflection of her younger self, the same fierce intelligence, the same quiet determination, but without the heavy cloak of invisibility she had been forced to wear. She saw the future, and it was bright. A shadow fell over their table. "Amani, sorry I'm late. The traffic on the FDR was a nightmare." Arthur Sterling stood there, not with the stiff, arrogant posture of a year ago, but with the easy, relaxed warmth of a friend. He slid into the booth beside Amani, his gaze immediately turning to Keisha. "And you must be Keisha," he said, extending his hand. His smile was genuine, completely devoid of his former condescension. "It's an absolute honor to meet you. We are all so proud of everything you're accomplishing." Keisha, flustered and star-struck, shook his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling. I wouldn't be here without Dr. Williams." "None of us would," Sterling said quietly, his eyes meeting Amani's in a moment of shared, profound understanding. A young server, new and nervous, approached their table. "Good afternoon. Can I get you something to drink?" he asked, his hands trembling slightly as he held out the wine list. Sterling took it, his eyes scanning the page. For a fleeting second, his gaze passed over the word Traminer. A ghost of a memory, a flicker of his own shame crossed his face before vanishing. He looked up at Amani, a small, self-aware smile touching his lips. Then he closed the menu. "3 iced teas would be perfect, thank you," he said to the young man, his tone kind and encouraging. As the server walked away, Sterling turned his attention back to their conversation, discussing the expansion of the Hidden Talent Initiative into his other properties. He and Amani spoke as equals, as partners, their conversation a seamless blend of business strategy and a shared vision for a more humane corporate world. Keisha watched them, her expression rapt. She was not just a witness to a business lunch. She was seeing a new reality being forged right in front of her. She saw a black woman who had once served in this very room, now commanding the respect of one of the most powerful men in the city. She saw that man listen to her, defer to her, learn from her. She was seeing the bridge that Amani had built, and she was realizing with a thrill that started in her soul that it was strong enough for her to cross too. Imani felt Keisha's stare and smiled. This was the echo. This was the legacy. It wasn't the name on the scholarship or the title on her door. It was the look in this young woman's eyes, a look of boundless, unapologetic possibility. The story had come full circle, but it wasn't an ending. It was a beginning, endlessly refracting, a cycle of dignity passed from one hand to the next. The insult that had started it all was now just a whisper, drowned out by a rising chorus of new voices. And in the quiet clink of glasses, in a world that had once demanded her silence, the most beautiful sound was the beginning of a new conversation.